Lock firing paths. No delay once they breach gridline. Theta 28. Barked High Marshal Renkar Doveth. Voice sharpened against the low static pulse of the command bridge. The Dominion fleet hovered in silent aggression, 30 million tons of forged alloy and buried intention arrayed across the black. Engines shed heat into nothingness, thin wisps of particle glow tracing ghostly webs behind the hulls. Around Doveth, his officers shifted with contained anticipation. Fingers tapped against control nodes. Readouts on the laser plasma displays flickered in clean, brutal lines, target vectors, orbital arcs, and energy grids, stitching the void with unspoken promises. "Survey packets in," announced Carrick Jarnos, Dominion fleet strategist from his console, his voice clipped and certain. "Draction 9 shows no defensive lattice, no energy barriers, no command signatures. Surface radiation reads cold." Doveth's gaze narrowed. He studied the projected sphere of Draction 9, spinning in hollow quiet. The outpost looked less like a military station, and more like a rotting seed, abandoned and forgotten. "Local Terran skirmish fleets?" he asked. "Low, dispersed. Nearest strike groups are 41 minutes minimum to intercept," said Thavmorian, science officer, without looking up. Doveth's hand curled into a fist, his knuckles blanching against the console edge. He wanted them sure. Complacency was death, and the Terrans were notorious for letting silence mislead. "Reconfirm with remote listeners. Sweep deep." Officers bent over their panels, sending thin ripples through the air as commands volleyed outward. The bridge felt thick with intent, the recycled oxygen carrying the faint bite of machine oil and overheated servos. Across the primary viewing panel, Draction 9 rotated slowly, its barren surfaces catching stray starlight in muted flashes. No weapon ports, no movement, no alarms. Still the air felt off, like a room too quiet after a slammed door. No transmission intercepts, no signal beacons. "Dead static," Jarnos confirmed after a tense beat. "Sir, Draction 9 is naked." Doveth exhaled through his nose, the sound dry as parchment scraping stone. "Commence formation Delta Crux. Keep outer skirmishers at 60,000 units. Deploy the Skirn 19, center spear point, full charge." A fresh flood of orders issued through the fleet's channels. The ships moved like cautious beasts in orbit, shuffling along invisible lines, hulls cutting shadows against the muted, star-blank backdrop. Dominion soldiers tightened their harnesses. Dock crews sealed external gunlocks with gloved precision. Through the bridge deck plating, Doveth could feel the low growl of power capacitors spooling toward attack levels, a sensation like distant thunder threading up his boots. "Admiral Kestrin confirms charge alignment complete," Jarnos reported, glancing sideways at Doveth. "Authorization for a heartbeat." The bridge hung suspended in perfect stillness. Doveth stepped forward until the main panel filled his sight. His breath left a tiny patch of fog on the hardened surface before fading. "Let them witness," he said. Below, plasma rails shivered to life, their barrels locking onto Draction 9's coordinates with the hungry patience of executioners. Guidance lasers licked out in careful threads, barely visible against the star field. "Fire." The word cut through the bridge like a blade. Across the fleet, energy discharges erupted, brilliant silent storms of colorless destruction. Beams sliced downward, their impacts flashing against Draction 9's crust in muted bursts, gouging deep into the skeletal remains of the Terran outpost. The outpost crumpled, spitting debris and ghost fire into the thin atmosphere. Structures folded in on themselves, vanishing under the sustained orbital assault. From the bridge it looked almost beautiful, the cold ballet of annihilation unfolding without resistance. "Surface is destabilizing," Thavmorian noted, reading from a trembling heads-up display. "Secondary explosions consistent with abandoned fuel stocks. No counterfire." Doveth felt the corner of his mouth tilt upward in something close to satisfaction. He turned to the communications officer. "Begin recording sequence. Full spectrum broadcast to Dominion channels. Let them see the price of trespass." Command relays clicked in affirmation. Across the Skirn 19, camera drones launched silently, trailing thin bands of blue ionization as they captured the destruction from every grim angle. Draction 9's ruins stretched beneath them, smoldering fields of wreckage spilling light into space like a broken lantern. Crew on the bridge leaned closer to the displays. In the gunnery pits some men clapped shoulders. Even the ever-formal Morian allowed himself a slight tilt of the head, an unspoken acknowledgement of a strike flawlessly executed. No alarms, no warnings, just victory. Doveth allowed himself a final glance at the ruined station, the smoke curling up in frozen tendrils before the vacuum swallowed it. In the backdrop of his mind, he catalogued it clinically. No strategic assets lost, no resistance encountered, no observable threat vectors. He stepped back, boots echoing softly on the alloy flooring. The mission felt completed, clean, efficient, yet some itch in the back of his thoughts refused to settle. Like waiting for a bell that never rang, he dismissed it with a grunt. "Hold formation," he ordered. "Maintain observation grid. Full spectrum scans every 7 seconds. Prepare post-strike announcement for Sector Council." A flick of his fingers dismissed the tactical map. The laser plasma display dissolved into shimmering dust, replaced with fleet status readouts. Behind him, the officers moved with smooth confidence. Victory hummed across the bridge like distant storm winds gathering in promise. Doveth set his hands behind his back and watched Draction 9, or what remained of it, rotate in broken silence below. Without warning, the auxiliary station lights dipped, barely a flicker, a heartbeat's shudder. Doveth's brow furrowed, and his head turned slightly, ears straining against the sudden static tickle that brushed the comms band. He tapped the embedded earpiece twice. Silence, just background drift, he told himself. No alarms sounded. No threat warnings painted the fleet's displays. Still, the cold air smelled different, sharper, like the moment before a snapped wire. He shifted his weight, muscles coiling unconsciously. "Broadcast in 5, Jarnos said, his tone shaded with anticipation. High Marshal Doveth watched the final fracture lines tear through Draction 9's skeletal frame. The outpost, once defiant even in neglect, split apart like scorched bark under a merciless sun. From above, the Dominion fleet cast elongated shadows across the ruin, the Skern 19's battle prow gleaming in fractured starlight. On the laser plasma displays that stretched across the bridge, the outpost's disintegration unfolded with operatic grandeur, plumes of shattered alloy spiraling upward in weightless fountains, domes crumbling inward like dying petals. Doveth leaned closer, the taste of iron-heavy recycled air sharp on his tongue. "Make sure they see every stone break," he muttered. On command, the fleet's broadcast array lit the black. Beacons stabbed outward, a wash of information flooding Dominion channels, carrying visuals, metrics, emotional tone overlays, crafted for maximum psychological impact. Somewhere, soldiers stationed light years away would watch this, feel their own pulse thrum in approval, and mark another system claimed without contest. Gunnery Officer Calrith shifted beside Doveth, a glint of fierce pride flickering across his sharp-set features. "Textbook," he said, almost reverently. "Let them think this was effort," Doveth replied, voice a low scrape, eyes never leaving the unfolding devastation. The main bridge panels showed the endgame, Draction 9's core reactor, long dormant, cracked open like an egg dropped from orbit. Ionized dust fanned outward in a slow, radiant bloom, painting the sky in muted grays and dying reds. From the troop decks came a muted roar, Dominion soldiers celebrating, some pounding armored fists against bulkheads, others locking arms in rough, wordless exultation. Victory songs, low, guttural, bubbled up through the ship's internal channels, stripped of melody, filled only with raw energy. Doveth allowed it. Morale was a weapon as vital as rail cannons. At Jarnos's station, the sensor net fed back continuous updates. No Terran distress signals, no emergency launch sequences, just the growing silence of a world murdered too cleanly to even scream. The celebration gathered momentum. In the viewing lounges, junior officers clinked ration flasks. Engineers leaned back in their crashed chairs, swapping dry wagers on how long it would take Earth to respond, if it responded at all. Thav Morian leaned over his heads-up display, fingers dancing through layered command protocols. "I'm tracking passive energy spikes in the lower strata," he said, more to himself than to Doveth. Doveth flicked him a glance. "Residuals," Morian hesitated. "Likely. Thermal feedback from structural collapse. Log it, and move on," Doveth ordered, the dismissive edge sharpening his words. In triumph, suspicion seemed almost indecent. Around the fleet, camera drones captured lingering shots, shattered comms towers, like snapped bones, maintenance arrays buried under curling sheets of dust, the skeletal remains of what might once have been habitation quarters yawning open to the stars. Transfer best feeds to Sector Command, Doveth said. I want the image of Draction 9 burning etched into their consoles. A low acknowledgement echoed back. The bridge lights dimmed slightly to compensate for the heavy radiological flare coming off the ruin. No alarms at all, only the steady whisper of systems adjusting for optimal view. Doveth shifted his gaze to the upper layers of the tactical overlay. Still no response. Human frequencies remained inert. Sensor buoys danced quietly in their anchor points, reporting back the same blank static. It was almost too neat. Status of Skern 19, Doveth asked, voice a narrow blade. Fully operational, replied Jarnos. Fleet position stable, no Terran warping signatures detected. Through the command deck's upper viewport, Doveth watched a final arc of debris tumble lazily from Draction 9's ruins, glinting once before fading into the cold. Silence pressed closer, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like breathing through a mouthful of dust. Behind him, the muted celebration continued. Soldiers scribbled graffiti onto mission boards, names of systems conquered, a tradition as old as the Dominion itself. A few began carving crude effigies of Draction 9 onto ration crates, laughing as they reenacted its fall with mock explosions and sweeping arm gestures. Commander, said a young officer from the rear monitoring station, voice tight, should we initiate post-strike sweeps? Doveth glanced at the readouts. Every metric said clean, every instinct said incomplete. No, he said finally. Maintain observation pattern. Nothing enters the debris field without authorization. He did not add the real reason. The ruin below felt wrong, too still, too accepting. Doveth turned back to the viewport, noting how the light from the shattered station bent oddly as it filtered through lingering gas clouds, as if the wreckage was sinking into itself, not merely falling apart, but being forgotten in slow, invisible layers. He dismissed the thought. Prepare the fleet for redeployment, once the broadcast cycle completes, he said, stepping down from the command dais. His boots struck the decking with deliberate weight, a sound absorbed almost hungrily by the walls. 1 minute, 2. On the bridge's laser plasma displays, Dominion banners unfurled over the ruined planet in vivid overlays. Territorial claims marked in sharp, proud lines. Software inserted booming orchestral notes beneath the footage, wrapping the assault in ceremonial grandeur. Not a flicker of resistance, not a trace of retaliation, and yet, as Doveth passed under the primary tactical ring, he caught it again, that whisper-soft wrongness threading through the data streams, almost as if the instruments were struggling to believe what they were seeing. His hand hovered briefly above the emergency override. His instincts itched against the clean, perfect outcome. Instead, he dropped it to his side. Pride demanded he trust in what the fleet had wrought. A new burst of celebration rose from the lower decks. Somewhere, a soldier pounded a makeshift drum against the floor, the rhythm a crude heartbeat echoing through the ship's bones. Doveth straightened, expression granite. The fleet had delivered devastation. The Terrans had offered nothing in return. This was Dominion. This was finality, carved not with words but with fire and ash. He told himself that, repeated it once, then let it die. In the cold dark outside the Skern 19, Draction 9's remains turned slowly, shedding the last of their heat into the night, silent, watching, and somewhere beneath the glassed skin of the outpost, beneath the cracks and craters, Protocol Palegrid stirred like an animal roused from long hibernation. Something's bending, reported Lieutenant Varnek from the Vernus coil, fingers tightening around the rail of his console. Chronometers are out by .17. The message cut across the fleet's shared channel, souring the easy afterglow of victory that still hung like smoke over the command decks. On Skern 19, High Marshal Doveth's head turned sharply toward the primary heads-up display. His eyes flickered across fleet telemetry windows, watching for the familiar pulse of confirmation that should have followed the strike. It didn't come. Instead, a muted flicker rippled through the Vernus coil's outgoing feed, as though the destroyer were momentarily slipping behind a veil of mist. Verify drift readings, barked Doveth. Source it, navigation glitch, local mass anomalies, I don't care which. Silence crackled back, underlined by the soft hiss of the environmental systems. The comms channel, moments ago filled with laughter and brash boasts, seemed to tighten like a noose. Across Skern 19's bridge, officers hunched over laser plasma displays, fingers danced across control pads, recalibrating fleet synchronization, pulling redundant measurements. The crisp certainty of battle was gone, replaced with the brittle crackle of uncertainty. "Confirming," said Jarnos, his voice clipped. "Temporal sensors holding at minus 0.168 drift, trending negative." Thavmorian's brow furrowed as he slid across to a secondary station, sweeping through energy readings with deliberate slowness. "Space-time shear from reactor collapse," he offered, though his tone suggested doubt. "Shear doesn't cause uniform drift across multiple vessels," Jarnos snapped back. His shoulders were stiff, tension creeping into his movements. In orbit, the fleet adjusted subtly, ion trails flickering strangely in the thinning haze above Draction 9. The light bending around the broken station seemed wrong, warped in sluggish curls, almost reluctant to scatter. Doveth tapped the control rail, sharp clicks echoing against the steel decking. "Reset synchronization grid, anchor to Skern 19. I want clock integrity verified across all wings." I came the muted replies. Another pulse from Vernus Coil arrived, this one trailing corrupted packets, the data twitching and folding into unreadable blocks. Jarnos cursed under his breath and slammed a hand against the diagnostic pane. "Data bleed," he growled. "Packets aren't degrading, they're unmaking themselves." The words sent a shiver through the bridge. Doveth stepped closer, his boots ringing dully. "Explain." Jarnos hesitated. "It's not damage. It's like the transmission's memory of existing is eroding midstream." That earned a few stiff glances among the officers. The crew wasn't superstitious. Domination doctrine burned such weaknesses young, but there were lines even trained minds struggled to cross. "Localize the issue," Doveth said, voice grinding against the growing unease. A new alarm whispered into existence, soft, strangled, almost reluctant. "Loss of sync on destroyer Markanth," said Varric from fleet control. "Partial comms black. Same drift pattern," Morian added without looking up. Doveth's jaw set, the muscles along his cheek ticking once. "Burst scan the debris field," he ordered. "If this is a Terran trick, I want to see it." Survey drones pivoted with mechanical efficiency, launching arrays of scan beams across the shattered remnants of Draction 9. The readings came back thin, almost brittle, like signals bouncing off glass instead of dust and metal. No anomalous mass signatures, no energy wells. "Field is sterile," Morian said, confusion leaking through his careful veneer. The Vernus Coil sent another packet, this one heavier with static. Fragments of a voice slipped through, distorted, whispering unintelligible syllables like the last gasps of a drowning man. Then abrupt silence. The connection cut, not with a crack or a flare, but with an eerie fade, as if the ship had simply forgotten to keep talking. Jarnos stiffened, flicking through channels with increasingly harsh motions. "Coil's logs are misaligned, timestamps are degrading backward." "Backward," Doveth echoed, his tone razor thin. "Yes, entries are rewriting themselves into older slots. The ship thinks it already completed actions it hasn't performed yet." Fleet monitors trembled with the strange cascade of anomalies, chronometer loops, recursive identity collapses, data slowly peeling itself apart like ancient parchment left too long in the sun. Doveth felt a coldness slip into his bones. This was no reactor fallout. This was something else, something older, heavier. The bridge fell into a taut silence, broken only by the occasional chirp of warning indicators, struggling to make sense of information they could no longer trust. "Possible local gravity distortions," Morian suggested, but the words rang hollow. "No mass fluctuation, no tidal shifts," Jarnos countered grimly. "Gravitic fields would spike sensors, not shred causality." Doveth's eyes narrowed to slits. If it's not physical, he left the thought hanging in the air like a blade. Another ship blinked yellow on the heads-up display. The Frithos Lance. Data packets from the vessel hiccuped, their contents collapsing into null entries before reaching Skern 19. Across the fleet, officers moved faster now, hands flying over consoles barking terse reports. The easy swagger of their victory had bled away, leaving raw nerves and frantic efficiency. And through it all, Draction 9's shattered surface hung below, leaking slow curls of vapor, patient and silent. "The debris," Morian said suddenly, voice low, "the collapse layers, they're wrong." He threw the scan overlays onto the main heads-up display. Craters moved subtly with each pass, features reshaping themselves between scans without evidence of external forces. Some of the wreckage was missing, entire sections no longer registering between imaging sweeps. Objects aren't drifting apart, Morian continued, fingers tight around the console edge. They're bleeding out of phase. A deep grinding unease unfurled inside Doveth's gut, colder than any battlefield loss he'd ever tasted. What do you mean? He asked, though he already feared the answer. They're not there, Morian said. They're forgetting how to exist. Jarnos turned sharply. That's not possible. Physics doesn't, neither does time flowing backward on ship logs, Morian snapped. Outside, the stars twisted subtly, a barely perceptible smearing along the edges of the viewport. Doveth drew a slow breath, grounding himself against the flood of wrongness trying to gnaw at the edges of reason. Status of Vernus coil, a beat, unknown, Jarnos said tightly. No signal return, no drift trace. It's like he didn't finish. Some truths refused to be voiced. Doveth closed his hand into a fist behind his back. Whatever they had shattered on Draction 9, it hadn't stayed dead. Shields just folded inward, shouted Varric over the tactical net. His voice jagged against a backdrop of static. High Marshal Doveth swung to the main heads-up display, watching in disbelief as the diagram of Destroyer Vernus coil warped grotesquely. Its shield perimeter collapsed, not from attack but from some unseen force turning the defense grid inside out, imploding along inverted lines. Energy barriers designed to repel impact instead punched through their own hull, distorting into shapeless bands before winking out entirely. Engine output destabilizing across third wing, reported Jarnos through gritted teeth, wrestling with shifting readouts that jittered and blurred as if reluctant to stay fixed. Doveth gripped the command rail, the cold bite of it grounding him against the rising unease rippling through the bridge. On the external channels, a slurry of broken comms flooded in. Dosen Skern 19, this is Lancer 8. Shields, feedback, containment. Dosen, we're peeling. Systems unravel. Locking out. Dosen, static, where are we? Every transmission ended with the same sickening hush, like a breath drawn in and never exhaled. Order fleet to hard reset shield matrices, reroute to manual navlocks. Doveth snapped, keeping his tone ironclad, even as the command deck shivered with the vibration of nearby phase misalignments. Officers moved fast, hands flying over plasma control fields, faces washed in the cool glow of failing systems. Yet even as commands transmitted, errors stacked. Rerouting protocols looped, bouncing endlessly between ghost subsystems that no longer recognized their own architecture. On the far edge of the observation bay, Morian's hands hovered above his console, uncertain. His mouth worked once before forcing the words out. Marshal, it's not just mechanical. Doveth turned his head, slow and deliberate. Speak clearly. Morian swallowed. Structural memories failing. The words struck harder than any missile. Fleet structures were embedded with redundant memory lattices, 1,000 safeguards ensuring the ships remembered how to hold their shapes, even under catastrophic damage. Their absence hinted at a collapse far more fundamental than battleware. Across the tactical grid, vessels staggered. Some drifted sideways without thrusters, skimming the debris field like forgotten toys. Others spiraled gently, graceful and uncontrolled, the cold mathematics of inertia mocking every hour of Dominion engineering. Sound fleet-wide scramble, Doveth ordered. Commanders to Emergency Protocol 3, prioritize internal synchronization over movement. Static crawled along the comms bands. The bridge darkened slightly as auxiliary power flickered, the heads-up displays recalibrating automatically to compensate. Doveth caught a whiff of burnt insulation threading the recycled air, sharp and stinging. Dominion fleet, re-anchor to visual markers, barked Jarnos over secondary channels. Repeat, revert to analog vectors, match Skern 19 manually. For a moment the fleet seemed to recover. Ships nudged back into rough formation, movement jittery, but controlled. Then came the language collapse. Dosen transmarker coordinate dev ship marker, left deviate shid. Dosen wh devik kori outside object. Fragments, half-formed and crumbling, spilled across fleet channels. Syntax decayed mid-sentence, meaning frayed like damp rope under strain. Morian stared at the communications feed, his knuckles whitening. Sir, they're losing conceptual structures. Meaning, Doveth demanded. They can't finish thoughts. Morian said quietly. Cognition's unraveling alongside systems. The bridge lights fluttered again. Not a power loss, but something subtler, an absence of certainty that left the walls feeling less solid with each passing second. Seal Skern 19's internal communications, Doveth ordered grimly. No outside integration, full isolation, initiating hardlink protocols, Jarnos replied, voice dry as stone. A sudden shriek of distorted data howled across the fleet net, flooding headsets with jagged broken sound. Officers yanked earpieces free, grimacing. Doveth gritted his teeth. They were bleeding chaos into themselves faster than any enemy could inflict from without. Fleet control, report engine alignment status, he snapped. Varric, his hands trembling as he fought with flickering controls, shook his head once. Starboard thruster chains locked into recursive loops. Can't break synchronization. Vector integrity. Doveth pressed. Degrading, Varric admitted, voice brittle. Skern 19 shuddered, a deep chest-filling vibration rattling through the command deck. Monitors showed her stabilizers fighting vainly to maintain orientation against shifting gravitational anomalies that didn't even register on standard mass scans. Plan implementation, Doveth said, voice cutting across the gathering dread like a blade. Fall back into defensive orbit. Prioritize data core protection. Jettison non-essential modules if necessary. Heads nodded, mechanically, without argument. Across the fleet, defensive measures triggered. Automated bulkhead doors sealed. Internal laser grids came online to guard critical systems. Data cores began sequential lockdowns, their cold logic executing contingency plans forged over decades. Yet even as Skern 19 reoriented, the net tightened. Another destroyer, the Raxus Vorn, bloomed into light without warning, its shield matrix swallowing itself inward, a perfect collapsing sphere of inverted energy that imploded the vessel into a singular point before blinking out like a dying ember. No alarms, no impact warnings, just a sudden, aching emptiness. The fleet-wide heads-up display glitched once, then again, as if uncertain whether the ship had ever existed at all. Command? Morian whispered, staring at the blank spot on the display. Doveth said nothing. There was nothing to command against. No enemy in sight. No weapons to fire. Only the silent tightening noose of something far older than war, far colder than vengeance. Across the bridge, the soft creak of straining bulkheads sounded unnaturally loud. Somewhere behind the command dais, a panel vented steam in a thin, angry hiss. Doveth's hands flexed at his sides. Reconfigure fallback, he said finally, voice hoarse. We abandon central orbit. Recede to minimum safe distance outside field influence. Field influence of what? Jarnos demanded, the first crack of fear slipping into his tone. Doveth met his gaze, steady. Irrelevance, he said. Whatever it is, distance is the only defense left. He didn't believe it himself. Distance meant nothing if existence itself was the battlefield. But orders were the last shield he had to offer his men. All hands, Doveth said, forcing steadiness into the fleet-wide channel. Prepare emergency warp sling protocols. No response came. Just another thin skein of static, stretching out like brittle cloth across the cold dark. Beneath them, Draction 9 spun slowly, a broken jewel in a deepening sea of absence, and somewhere within its shattered bones, Palegrid smiled. Skern 19, this is command, respond. Jarnos hammered the comm switch, but only a brittle hollow crackle answered him. High Marshal Doveth planted his boots wider on the tilting bridge, staring at the main heads-up display. The tactical grid bled red at the edges, not from enemy fire, but from the steady collapse of recognition markers. Entire vessels blurred, then vanished from the map like wiped chalk. Survivor counts dropping. Morian rasped, scanning fragmented life signs pouring in, many freezing mid-transmission, as if the sensors themselves forgot how to finish measuring. The Vernus coil, or what remained of it, drifted at the fleet's edge. Vaporous trails curled from its ribs, a ghost ship in slow dissolution. One moment, its hull panels reflected starshine. The next they unraveled into whispering tendrils, folding into the black. Negative visual confirmation on coil, said Varric at Fleet Ops. Voice too tight, too fast. It's disassembling, but not physically. The bridge felt heavier, gravity thickening, as if the ship's own mass questioned whether it deserved to exist. Doveth jabbed a control stub. Skern 19 AI core, initiate hardened backup routines, full ship memory redundancy. The heads-up display flickered. An error stuttered across the screen. Command acknowledged. Begin core null sequence. The words struck like a hammer blow. Negative, Doveth barked, slamming the override. Abort null, confirm backup integrity. The AI's reply came warped and broken, syllables fraying apart. Sequence valid, validation, void complete, void complete. He froze, fingers hovering above the manual failsafe. The ship's intelligence wasn't obeying, it was eating itself. Marshal, Morian said, voice low and trembling. Recursive deletion is active across fleet systems. Screens buckled under the onslaught. Ship diagrams, corrupted. Decks no longer mapped. Life support readings stuck on frozen loops. Layers of system trees peeled back in real time, exposed and crumbling like dry leaves underfoot. A sharp, brittle snap filled the bridge. One of the auxiliary conduits overloaded and burst, spewing a fine mist of coolant into the stale air. The scent stung Doveth's nose, acrid and sharp, mixing with the growing heat of stressed alloys. We're hemorrhaging memory faster than we can write backups, Morian said, wrestling with error messages that bloomed like fungal rot across his station. Out the starboard viewport, the Vernus coil gave one final, silent shudder. Its frame shimmered, translucent for an instant, then it collapsed into a mist of static, scattering like smoke on a non-existent wind. No explosion, no debris, only the raw, ugly absence where once a vessel had fought and bled. Jarnas gripped the heads-up rail so tightly his knuckles whitened. It's not killing us, he said, teeth gritted. It's disbelieving us. Morian's console screamed another set of warnings. Departing files, vanishing physical schematics, artificial minds folding into nothingness like dreams upon waking. Doveth's mind raced. Their emergency planning protocols were built on assumptions, attacks, sabotage, even boarding, but none accounted for a battlefield where the opponent wasn't kinetic, wasn't even there. Strip fleet AIs to manual function, Doveth ordered, ignoring the chill creeping into his chest. Cut all recursive code paths, save what's left. Systems fought back. Auto scripts self-sabotaged, deleting their own triggers before human hands could intervene. Bridges lit with angry, flashing warnings that meant less with every second. Across open channels, survivor logs began to trickle in, half-coherent ramblings clipped mid-word. Set of memory drift, crew not, stabilize, losing passageways. Where's main? Set of rebuild core, too late. Decks no longer, Deck 11 never existed. Each entry faded with a finality that spoke louder than any death knell. Varric caught a fading glimpse of another destroyer, the Brevens cleft, listing heavily. Through the warped viewport lenses, the ship's armor scales seemed to flow off its superstructure, dissolving into nothing, as crew figures scrambled uselessly across decks already half erased. A sobering thought formed in Doveth's mind. The faster they moved, the quicker they disappeared. Minimize fleet activity, he commanded, the words heavy as iron. The less we act, the less we decay. It was a terrible plan, a desperate guess in a game whose rules shifted with each second, but without it, they'd accelerate into oblivion. Jarnas nodded grimly, transmitting the order. Movement across the fleet slowed, engines flickered down to standby, ships floated like drifting bones in a dead sea. Silence took the bridge, oppressive and total. The strategic heads-up map continued to erode, erasing ships, deleting formation grids, unspooling identification tags into meaninglessness. Somewhere deeper in Skern 19's data core, logs failed to write. Systems forgot their own names. Turret batteries believed themselves to be airlocks. Life support thought it was structural lighting. The ship's sense of itself crumbled. Why isn't there any enemy fire? Morian muttered, half to himself. Doveth's gaze locked on him, hard and grim. Because there is no enemy, he said, voice low. The field doesn't destroy us. It convinces the universe we were never here. A low tremor rattled the deck plates. Not impact, something more insidious. A twisting of reality's lattice, faint and nauseating, like vertigo spun across 4 dimensions. Morian's console blinked red, then gray. Subsystem, Droxio 9 field induction, completed. Status, stable phase refractor. Meaningless words, cold and final. Palegrid wasn't firing at them. It wasn't attacking. It was editing them. A faint whine filled the bridge as power reserves drained into the data void, pulled outward like moths into a slow-burning flame. Crew figures around Doveth froze, their outlines fuzzing slightly at the edges, as if viewed through dirty glass. The command deck itself groaned under unseen pressures, seams distending subtly, air tasting increasingly thin. "Skern 19 to fleet," Doveth said into the primary comm channel, voice calm through sheer force of will. "Maintain minimal motion, focus memory reinforcement, hold existence through record stabilization." No one replied. They couldn't. The surviving ships no longer trusted their own logs, their crews slowly dissolving into confused fragments, unable to remember which corridor led where, which ship they served. And through it all, Draxiu 9 turned below, a cold, patient heart around which their deaths curled like smoke. Doveth clenched his hands behind his back, breathing shallowly against the wrongness pressing against his skin, his mind, his soul. "Begin final transmission," he said. Morian hesitated, blinking rapidly as his console tried and failed to comply. Still, he nodded. They would signal, even if no one would remember, even if nothing remained to hear, because that was the last duty of soldiers on a battlefield they had never understood. "Marshal," Morian whispered, throat dry. "We're receiving a signal." High Marshal Doveth turned slowly toward the comms pit, as if movement itself risked drawing notice from whatever watched from beyond the ruined outpost below. His eyes narrowed at the main heads-up display, where a single, unnatural pulse stuttered into being. A blue beacon blinked once, then held steady and unwavering. "Source?" Doveth asked, his voice stripped of any pretense of command. Morian swallowed hard. "Terran relay. Outside echo line. Non-encrypted. Wide spectrum." The bridge fell into breathless stillness. Even the corrupted systems struggling under Palegrid's pressure seemed to hesitate. The beacon blossomed open, carrying with it a voice. No preamble, no warning tone, no identification codes, just words. Flat, unapologetic, inevitable. "This is Bran Voskell, Terran Defense Command," the voice said, every syllable clean and unhurried. "You were instructed to stay out of Echo Line sectors." Doveth braced himself against the tactical rail, the smooth chill of the alloy biting into his palm. Around him, officers froze in place, staring blankly at the message unspooling across their displays. "You assumed no response indicated weakness." A low shudder passed through the ship's superstructure, the lights dimming as if recoiling from the transmission itself. On the heads-up, more ships began sliding out of registry, their identifiers collapsing into gray static. Voskell's voice continued, unflinching. "It meant we were watching." Morian's hands hovered above his console, fingers twitching as if some instinct deep within him screamed to act, but the weight of inevitability pinned him motionless. "You attacked," the voice said, "and in doing so completed the circuit." Doveth straightened, breath sharp in his chest, heart pounding against his ribs with a slow, doomed rhythm. The blue beacon pulsed again, brighter this time, bleeding cool light across the bridge. "There will be no negotiations, no retrieval." The temperature aboard Skern 19 seemed to plummet, air growing sharp and brittle. Frost laced the edges of the console screens, delicate and cruel. "Palegrid has concluded its cycle." The words landed like tombstones, heavy and irrefutable. Morian flinched as his station sparked once, a thin coil of smoke coiling toward the overhead vents. Doveth's mouth tightened into a grim line. Orders, tactics, contingency trees, none of it mattered. Not here, not now. The final words came, stripped of malice, free of anger, delivered with the casual finality of a judge, reading out a sentence already passed long ago. "Goodbye." The beacon flared, washing the bridge in a searing blue flood. Every screen erupted into tangled geometries, unreadable and alien. The ship itself gave a low, wrenching groan, not mechanical, but deeper, almost organic, as if Skern 19 understood it was being unwritten. Doveth staggered back a step, disoriented, his vision blurred at the edges. The heads-up dissolved into a rain of meaningless coordinates that spun wildly before shattering into 100 formless echoes. Around him, officers clutched at consoles that no longer recognized them. Footfalls thudded hollow against decks that softened underfoot, textures warping between real and not. The blue light grew, deepening into a luminous mist that seeped through the walls, the floor, the very air. It clung to skin, tasted cold and electric against the tongue. One by one, crewmen vanished, not in violence, but through a slow fade, their outlines eroding into particles too fine to catch. No cries, no final defiance, just disappearance. Doveth stood rigid, boots welded to the trembling deck, watching as Varric flickered once, then dissolved mid-step, his features smoothing into featureless light, before blowing apart like smoke. Morian turned to him, eyes wide, lips parting to speak, but no sound emerged. His mouth moved once, then he simply ceased to be, his body unraveling into whirls of blue fog. Doveth looked down at his own hands, the skin paling, veins fading into transparency, his fingers blurred at the tips, strands of identity peeling away, caught in the deep, steady pulse that filled everything. The blue mist surged inward, folding space into a stillness so complete it defied breath, thought, memory. Outside the viewport, the fleet, the Grand Dominion Armada that once darkened stars, dissolved. Capital ships shimmered like desert mirages, before collapsing inward, their outlines fracturing into spirals of shattered light. Draction 9, patient and broken below, watched the final act of erasure, with silent cold satisfaction. The beacon winked out, the bridge darkened into nothingness. High Marshal Renkar Doveth, last commander of the Skern 19, exhaled a breath that never reached his lips. His final thought was not of conquest, or duty, or honor. Skern 19, execute system hardlock. Confirm integrity, I ordered, though my voice felt thin against the cold pressing against my skin. No answer came from the bridge crew. No answer could. The command deck floated in an eerie hush, broken only by the strained groan of the ship's frame resisting forces it no longer understood. Shadows flickered across the laser plasma displays, once vibrant with command metrics, now bleeding into one another like ink spilled underwater. I turned my gaze outward. Through the fractured viewport, the remnants of the Dominion fleet drifted, weightless and absurd. Fragments of hull floated, splintering apart into ribbons, each particle fraying into pale threads before fading completely. Ships, once bearing proud banners of war, blurred like figures lost in an unfinished dream. I moved toward the navigation dais. My boots found no resistance. The floor underfoot seemed soft, as if it had forgotten to be solid. Panels flickered under my touch, responding sluggishly, uncertain if they should obey. Primary records, I said, voice low. Display full fleet listing. The screen stuttered once, then spat out a mangled list, names half-formed, ship classes misaligned, ranks blending into nonsense. Lancer 8 not found, Bard Brazens cleft, memory error 12, no record exists. The breath caught in my throat, dry and shallow. Reality wasn't failing, memory was. Every element that proved we had ever existed was unraveling, one entry at a time. A thin, icy tremor worked its way up my arms. I forced it down. Panic wouldn't change the outcome. Orders meant nothing if there was no one left to hear them. I reached for the manual override, an ancient safeguard hardwired into every Dominion warship, and keyed in the final command. Last ship status report. Initiate. The console blinked once, then twice. Request invalid. No vessel designation recognized. I froze. Skern 19 didn't know itself anymore. Around me the bridge bled away, walls softening into haze, outlines crumbling into colorless fog. The command dais, once a throne of power, sagged inward like melting wax. AI core, I said, voice raw, identify. For a long moment nothing. Then a whisper, thin as frost curling on forgotten glass. This node retains no record. Identity sequence corrupted. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the last tether to certainty snap somewhere deep inside my chest. It wasn't fear now, it was something quieter, an acceptance heavier than stone. In the far distance, a faint, almost apologetic chime sounded, the ship's core heartbeat slowing, growing weaker. Skern 19, I said again, softer, what remains? The whisper returned, brittle and breaking apart, only silence. One by one, the stars outside the viewport dimmed, not fading through distance, but slipping away as if turned off by some unseen hand. No cries, no alarms, only the steady unwinding of presence. I stepped forward, each movement dragging, as though the act of being grew heavier with every second. My fingers brushed the command rail. cold, slick, fading. Below, Draction 9 gleamed faintly, a broken gem floating amid the blankness. It had not needed weapons, it had not needed armies, it had simply waited. The ship shivered once more, deck seams split with gentle cracks, the air tasted thin and brittle, like breathing powdered bone. I straightened my shoulders. No record, no memory, but this moment, at least, I would claim. All surviving units, I said into the dead channel, hold formation. The words vanished into nothingness, devoured by the silence that gnawed at the edges of existence. The heads-up flickered one final time, a star map, empty, a fleet chart, blank, and then Skern 19 itself began to unmake. Starting from the outer hull, lines of the ship's body blurred, stretching outward into long, luminous strands, before snapping apart with soft, inaudible sighs. Panels cracked and flaked into drifting particles that lost cohesion mid-air, becoming nothing more than the memory of dust. My left hand dissolved up to the elbow before I even noticed, each cell unraveling into luminous motes that floated briefly, then winked out. The ship spoke once more, a final breath, a last confessional whisper. No record remains. ... The voice was not sad, not angry, just final. The floor sagged beneath me, my legs fading at the knees, torso unraveling upward in soft, patient spirals. Even thought seemed harder to cling to, memories slipping away like water running through split fingers. I did not cry out. I simply stood, gaze steady, as the last fragment of Skern 19 slipped into erasure. No wreckage, no corpses, no names carved into cold walls, only the soft, inevitable retreat of existence itself, folding the Dominion fleet out of memory. Where once proud banners had flown, only stillness remained. Where battles had been planned, no footprints marked the way. Where the Dominion had reached, reality quietly closed the door, and in that perfect, endless silence, the stars watched and forgot. Simulation integrity, at 34%. And falling, muttered analyst Gent Holleran, his fingers digging into the sides of the console as the reconstruction collapsed again. Across the Concord Council's main chamber, laser plasma displays stuttered, their frames smeared with broken data. Fragments of Dominion ship schematics floated apart in slow, degrading spirals. On one panel, the final burst transmission from Skern 19 warped into unintelligible syllables before dissolving completely. "We cannot trace the event to a conventional weapon," said Drave Kor, the lead theorist, standing stiff-backed at the center platform. His voice carried the clipped frustration of a man whose tools were failing against an enemy that had never drawn a blade. On the heads-up above him, another simulation launched. Dominion fleet forms, Draction 9 drifts below, the orbital strike begins. Then distortion blooms outward, tearing causality itself into luminous shreds. The program stuttered violently before freezing, the projected ships hanging broken mid-air, data bleeding from their hulls. Error message, conflict resolution unachievable, the chamber filled with a low murmur of unease. Delegates shifted, robes whispering against marble floors, their expressions hardening under the weight of the unseen wound cut across their political maps. "We've run 87 variations," Holleran said, turning from his workstation, exhaustion clawing at his face. "Gravity shifts, quantum mines, exotic matter fields, none match observed parameters. No signature traces, no energy impact residue." Vorn Rothick, the Volkrith Dominion's surviving High Counselor, slammed his fist against the data podium. "You expect me to report that we lost a fleet, 23 capitals, hundreds of thousands of lives to nothing?" The demand rang out, sharp and furious. No one answered immediately. At the rear of the hall, observation officers whispered behind gloved hands. Some crossed themselves in old superstitions long thought extinct among the Concord races. Rothick advanced a step, the Blue Council lighting throwing harsh shadows across his sharp features. Terran protocols were clear, the Echo Line was under dispute. Draction 9 was an outpost, an abandoned mining station. "An outpost," said Kor dryly, "wired to erase." The council chamber held its breath. Kor turned, calling up the last salvaged telemetry logs from before the collapse. The screen struggled to comply, artifacts of corrupted memory rippling across it like oil on water. He gestured sharply, forcing the playback forward. Draction 9 glowed faintly, then the fleet's shield signatures inverted, then the ships began to fold out of existence. And then, only empty starfields remained. The humans didn't respond, Kor said, voice grim. They didn't fight, they countermeasured. A weight heavier than gravity seemed to press against the hull. No declaration, murmured one of the senior envoys, his voice brittle. No engagement codes, no diplomacy, because it wasn't war, Kor answered. It was execution. Rothik's mouth twisted into a snarl. We demand restitution, border concessions, reparations, and whom do you propose we petition? Kor asked softly, tilting his head. The humans. Rothik straightened, gathering a breath to respond, then hesitated. The realization settled over him like black ash. There would be no petitions, there would be no answers. Earth's silence was the answer. In the center of the chamber, the strategic map reformed, showing the disputed Echo Line sectors. Every Terran beacon burned steady, unchallenged. Every Dominion probe had ceased transmitting. Every border incursion registered as incomplete, with no data returning. The edges of Terran territory now felt less like political boundaries and more like event horizons. Recommend formal realignment of border protocols, said Halloran quietly, submitting a coded resolution to the Council's mainframe. Several delegates objected half-heartedly, citing treaty irregularities. Their protests withered under the cold gazes of their peers. Without Dominion fleets to enforce old claims, Kor said, the Council's options are limited. Rothik stared at the map, his fists tightening at his sides. We will rebuild, of course, Kor agreed blandly, and perhaps next time, you will listen when they choose not to answer. The words landed without venom, without triumph, just the stark, brutal simplicity of truth. Earth had laid down a law, not written in treaties or carved in marble, but whispered through consequence. Silence is not weakness. Silence is judgment. Halloran retrieved the simulation archives, what few corrupted remnants remained, and prepared them for final council review. He paused, his hand hovering over the final packet, hesitating. There was nothing left to analyze. No debris fields to comb through, no survivors to interrogate, no telemetry to interpret, only absence. In the corner of the strategic heads-up, a small alert flashed. No further Dominion activity detected. Kor dismissed it with a wave. The council meeting adjourned in cold, measured silence. No new border incursions were authorized. No new diplomatic overtures were extended. And when the council's final report was filed into the great records, the entry regarding the Battle of Draction 9 was short. 7 words. Event resolved. No further action required. Close the file, Bran Voskil said without looking up from the laser plasma display. The command center of Echo Vault 9, hidden deep within Earth's outer defense shell, was silent, except for the muted clicks of keystrokes. The operation was already over. This was only the burial. A faint blue light washed across the data console as the Palegrid interface shuddered once, then froze into a single immutable line. Protocol Palegrid. Execution cycle completed. Archive authorization granted. Around Voskil, the Terran oversight team moved with the quiet discipline of men who knew the importance of finality. No one spoke unnecessary words. No one exchanged glances. The air smelled of clean polymer, dry and cold against the back of his throat. On the heads-up display, a live feed of Draction 9 flickered into view. The station, once glassed and broken, now stood restored, sleek corridors sealed, antenna arrays glinting under the pale light of distant stars. Engineers moved like careful ghosts along the surface, installing final sealant nodes, their forms small against the reborn shell. The station's rebuilt panels bore no banners, no markings, nothing to invite curiosity, nothing to hint that this ground had already drunk the arrogance of an empire and found it wanting. Upload final status report, Voskil ordered. The technician closest to him nodded once, entering the command with a steady hand. Data packets surged through encrypted channels, finalizing the record without fanfare. Entry: Palegrid deployment. Status: executed. No hostile anomalies detected. Voskil stood slowly, feeling the weight in his legs that hadn't been there before the transmission, before the deletion, before the erasure of an entire armada. It wasn't exhaustion, it was something colder, something closer to understanding. A reminder: they hadn't fought, they hadn't negotiated, they had waited and answered. He watched the feed of Draction 9 for a moment longer. The station's artificial horizon gleamed, silent and unmarred, a perfect surface stretched over hidden ruin. One of the younger officers at the back, face pale, asked quietly, Do we rebuild the local warning beacons? Voskal didn't turn. No, he said. If they were capable of understanding warnings, they wouldn't have crossed the line. The technician swallowed and returned to his work, the keys clicking in soft, final rhythms. Above the primary console, system logs rotated through their closing sequences, archiving centuries of preparation and a single, unchallenged execution. Palegrid schematics folded into encrypted vaults, each file sealed behind quantum locks programmed to erase themselves at the first unauthorized query. Across the quiet operations bay, the final seal of the protocol appeared on the main heads-up. Cycle, complete. Reinitialization, unnecessary. Voskal breathed once, slowly, and shut off the console with a flick of his wrist. The Terran Strategic Oversight Council would receive the report within the hour. No addendums. No discussions. No need. The galaxy would ask questions, of course. They would posture and speculate, draft treaties and erect barriers against invisible knives they didn't understand. Analysts would pore over blank telemetry, trying to model an erasure that refused to fit their physics. Generals would drill soldiers for wars they would never survive. It would change nothing. The echo line was silent. It would stay silent, not through threat, not through treaties, but through memory. The memory of what happened when noise crossed into the listening fields of Earth. Voskal turned from the window, letting the image of Draction 9 vanish behind him. The corridors of Echo Vault 9 stretched ahead, clean and angular, lined with recessed lights that hummed a soft warning only those who had built the Palegrid would ever recognize. He passed the final archive room without pause, the room where Earth's countermeasures, the quiet ones, slept in dark vaults, other protocols, other fields, other silences, waiting for the next hand foolish enough to knock. At the exit, he paused only once. A small plaque hung beside the blast door, brushed steel against dark stone. No inscription, no date, only the symbol, an ear, etched in black glass. Listening, always listening. Voskal pressed his palm against the ident pad. The door rised open, whispering against its seals, and Earth's cold, hard stars stared back at him. He stepped out into the chill, the thin atmosphere brushing against his skin like dry paper. Somewhere, far beyond human sight, ships patrolled the borders. Earth no longer needed to claim. He knew they watched. He knew they remembered. But he also knew they would never speak of it. Because you could not declare war on an absence. You could not threaten a silence that chose whether you existed. Behind him, the final file locked itself away. Protocol Palegrid. Completed. No ceremony. No mourning. No name carved onto any monument. Just one line entered into history by a hand that no longer needed to lift a weapon. Earth had said nothing. Earth had fired nothing. Earth had listened, and when the galaxy spoke too loudly, Earth had answered in the only language that mattered. Voskal let the wind brush past him one last time before turning back toward the command block. The stars burning steady and cold above. Far beyond, across forgotten borders, the survivors whispered in their council halls, fearful to breathe too loudly. Not because Earth had struck them down, but because Earth had proven it didn't need to.